start us off by playing a short game of trivia, which will require participation from you, the audience. And our category for today is United States media ownership. So our first question is 90% of all media in the United States is owned by how many companies? And your answers are 24, 6, or 18. Jalen? 6.
It's 6.
6 is correct.
Yes.
And I want to give you all a moment to take that in. 6 companies, 6 individual CEOs own 90% of the media that is portrayed in the United States. Now, these 6 corporations, as you can see, are Comcast, Disney, Paramount, AT&T, Sony, and News Corp. Now, our second question is, how many of these conglomerates have the same investment companies as top shareholders? And your answers are 2, 6, or 4.
3. Push 3.
4? 4 is correct. And these investment companies are BlackRock and Vanguard, and they are top investors in major parent companies including Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Kellogg. And as you can see on this pie chart, they obviously own a much larger amount of stock than other major investment companies do. So these 6 companies and their shareholders represent the extreme monopolization of wealth in the United States and the dangers that it poses to our democracy. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Mya Oyler, and for my senior project, I studied the effects that capitalism has on journalism. And I came up with a research question: how do corporations inhibit democracy by influencing news media? Wrong slide. I originally set out to understand the ways that news organizations perpetuate political polarization. But the more I learned, the more I found that journalism has undergone a major shift in the past 50 years that allowed for major corporations to have a really big influence on the media that we are consuming. And I first began to understand this by learning about the think tanks that are dominant in the United States, as well as how they evolved to be funded by private companies. Now, I researched the ways that media has become monopolized and what has allowed it to do so. I also studied rhetoric and propaganda to understand the ways that news outlets profit from citizen outrage and polarization. To understand the impact of this, I researched the ways that journalism is vital to a democracy. Journalism started to become more capitally influenced in the 1970s, when there was a perception from conservatives that the press was dominated by the left. Now, among the conservatives that opposed this was former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, and he wanted to devise a way to shift this left slant in the media. Now, in 1971, the now infamous Powell Memo was released, and in this he detailed a plan for neoconservatives to essentially buy back the debate. And they did this by heavily funding research institutions as well as think tanks. Now, neoconservatism is a subset of conservatism that values a laissez-faire economy as well as intervention-based foreign policy. Now, think tanks are organizations of political and economic experts that brainstorm the information that is at the forefront of the news. However, they become problematic when they are not working with the best interest of the public. In order to keep funding, they hold a bias towards these corporations and have an unspoken obligation not to publish dissenting information about them. Now, there's a disproportionate amount of neoconservative think tanks that are represented in the media, regardless of the outlet's political affiliation. This means that there is a large amount of information being presented in the media with a bias that's towards corporations that fund the think tanks. Now, the corporate biases in the media are covert and not really easily detectable, which makes it dangerous because there's large amounts of people unknowingly consuming information with a bias. Now, as you all learned at the beginning of this presentation, 90% of all media in the United States is owned by 6 major corporations. And this has been enabled by the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission. And part of this was because there was personal bribery to the FCC members by companies in order to loosen regulations. And this has been so drastic that in 1983, 90% of all media was owned by 50 corporations. So clearly there's been a massive monopolization of the media since then. The corporate bias in media is also just not representative of public opinion. According to a 2001 statistic in Justin Lewis's book, Constructing Public Opinion, the American public is actually far more fiscally liberal than represented in the media. An overwhelming amount of people support increased spending for the environment, education, healthcare, and minimum wage. By the subtle pro-corporate bias in the media, the public is essentially gaslit into believing that they're more fiscally conservative than they actually are. Now, majority of major news outlets in the United States are privately owned, which means that they have an obligation to profit. Media is often separated into partisan entities like Fox News and CNN to appeal to a specific consumer base. This allows for them to scapegoat the opposite side of the political spectrum and perpetuate an us versus them narrative that is overtly present in the media today. Now, when we are only focused on the opposite side, we often miss the bigger picture and the larger things that are at play for the issues in our society. There are a multitude of bipartisan issues in our society that simply don't get coverage because there's not one side to blame. Many corporations are also able to avert criticism through this because they don't fall cleanly into one side or the other. News programs are often set up in a debate-like format that makes us angry and want to tune into news because it's entertaining and it appeals to our need for drama. And this makes people addicted to the news and they continually tune into it, which then allows for the news outlets as well as their company of ownership to profit from this. And news outlets have become masters at making people addicted to them by utilizing propaganda. And propaganda is defined as buzzwords, phrases, or imagery that elicits an emotional reaction. Now, when people are in this emotional state, they're more vulnerable and more susceptible to believing false or exaggerated information and less likely to detect bias. Because of the extreme monopolization, there is a corporate bias in 90% of all media, which threatens a core pillar of democracy: fair access to unbiased information. By having access to a multitude of sources on either end of the political spectrum, we're given the impression that we have access to a multitude of information, when this is really kind of a facade. Democracy cannot thrive when profit is prioritized over the needs of the people. Even though these things all sound kind of grim, all hope is not lost for journalism. Individuals can take agency by consuming publicly funded journalism, like National Public Radio, NPR, or the Public Broadcasting System, PBS. To ensure the success of public radio, I would advocate that some tax dollars are reallocated to fund public radio. It is also vital that there is a re-implementation of FCC regulations that prohibit such extreme monopolization of the media. Currently, one corporation can own up to 39% of all media, which is insane because that's almost half. It's almost half of the media. And I would advocate that this number is decreased to 10%, so the ownership is broken up into at least 9 companies. Responsible journalism is vital to a democratic society, so we must make a change to ensure a thriving democracy. For my action project, I chose to do a podcast because it's an independent form of journalism, and let's be real, I also love the sound of my own voice. But really, I do really like listening to podcasts, and I was inspired to do this by a lot of my favorite podcasts. So they can be a really good way to make complex information a little bit more digestible by kind of verbally explaining it. Doing this project allowed me to practice journalism as well by conducting interviews. So my final episode was about 30 minutes long, and I explained some of the content that I review in my paper. To get a deeper perspective, I spoke with 2 local public radio advocates, and they shared with me the ins and outs of the journalism industry, as well as we spoke about the current issues and what solutions they would propose to them. And yeah, my podcast was essentially my paper's arguments broken into a more short-form, digestible format. I also focused a lot more specifically on the dangers of media monopolization to democracy. I explained the concept of late-stage capitalism in it and how media monopolization contributes to this theory. Often we hear about issues in our world and feel kind of overwhelmed and like we don't have the power to make a difference. But in my podcast, I try to offer a lot of solutions for people to change their own ways of consuming news so they don't feel so overwhelmed and nihilistic by these things. I interviewed the director of KDUR, Bryant Liggett, as well as the station manager at KSUT, Tammy Grant, and they gave me a perspective of how they're funded, as well as their own views on journalism, and gave advice on how to consume news ethically. My podcast addresses a major issue in our society and gives people the information that they need to make a personal change. I was able to break down complex, dense information and turn it into something a little bit more digestible for the average listener. And the word around the street is that my podcast is very good. So I would encourage you all to give it a listen. You can scan this QR code here and it'll take you to Anchor, which is a platform I used to edit it as well as upload it. You can also listen to it on Spotify. So my biggest lesson that I learned throughout this process was really just how to make a podcast. I really wanted to set myself up with this first episode to be able to continue making episodes of Bleeding Big Business in the future. Learning how to write a script, how to edit, and even how to upload onto a streaming site were really important things for me to learn if I want to continue doing something like this. I certainly still have room to grow in podcasting, but I feel like I did a really good job for this being my first time doing something like this. When I started working on my project, my goal was to make 3 episodes, with each episode surrounding a specific argument of my thesis paper. However, this did turn out to be a little bit too ambitious, and I had to cut it down to 1. But in this one episode, I really focused in on one specific argument and dove a lot deeper into the importance of public media than I do in my paper. Ultimately, I think I was able to learn a lot more by doing this, like really focusing in on one thing instead of trying to cover a lot of broad things. And even though I didn't accomplish my original goals, I'm walking away with a project that I'm really, really proud of. Capitalism has completely overtaken our society and is threatening the legitimacy of vital institutions like the press. We cannot continue to sit back and let corporations influence the information we consume. Learning about this topic was really fascinating to me, and I will continue to advocate for change through expressing the importance of publicly funded information. Thank you.
Time for questions. What questions?
Time for questions on this one.